George Mortimer Pullman was an inventor, an industrialist, and a revolutionizer. He was born in New York, where he thought of most of his ideas. At the age of 14, he dropped out of high school and started working on some inventions. In his earlier years, he moved to Chicago and helped with the problem of the sewage and mud, changing the structure of Chicago, even then. He formed with another wealthy businessman, and they started their Pullman luxury trains industry. The industry produced train cars that would run throughout the nation and were the finest on the line. Upon his growing number of employees, he purchased a suburb on the outskirts of Chicago and named it Pullman, which still stands today. Pullman had anything and everything, from universities to parks to housing, for all of his workers. It seemed as if anyone who was working there was living in the dream life. Pullman handled all of the money and took the rent out of your paycheck. The employees were paid fairly well, and the company was running smoothly. The year was 1839, and the economy suffered during a panic. As a retaliation to the loss of business, the Pullman Palace Car Company cut wages of its workers. A group of workers claimed that low wages and 12-hour days were horrible. The majority of these workers were the people that were part of the American Railway Union. This union had backed them up in a boycott of the Pullman Car Company. The strike efficiently closed down production in the Pullman factories and actually led to a shutout. Railroad workers all over the nation stayed with Pullman cars. The union then decided that they would have to strike altogether, not just against the Pullman Car Company. This organized boycott began on June 26, 1894. Throughout the first 4 days, 125,000 workers on 29 railroads had decided to quit. Railroad companies hired replacements. However, this only further fueled the strike. The African Americans involved in the railroad work decided to break the race barrier and join the strike. This added racial issues and the already large problems. The strike ended June 29, 1894, and had many consequential results. Not only was this one of the major pushes for the 8-hour workday, this also helped create many new unions that are still in effect today. Also, because of the strike, the overall idea of the workers changed. Workers were not just replaceable parts of a factory. They were treated more like people who had problems and needed to be listened to. Now that they could speak their mind, it had much more of an influence when a boss thought of any changes. This strike was one of the most important in history, and was a huge step in the right direction towards today's normal workday. The Pullman strike failure was the most influential part on the strike on the labor union across the U.S. Immediately after the strikes were subdued, there wasn't any turmoil. All of the strikers returned to work, and the ARU was gone. However, this uneventful aftermath has shown that the government's use of troops meant the government put the laborers as one of their last priorities. On the other hand, it let the American people know how much power they really had. As the publicity of the Pullman strike increased, more and more Americans saw the labor issues and realized it was time for reform. The Pullman Car Company was able to work through the strike by putting their mail in their cars. The United States mail was federally ran, and each individual state had no right to tamper with anything that the federal government did. Thus, the Pullman Car Company was able to still run, even though many of the workers were still striking. George Pullman also was not affected by any of the strikes and did not change. He made all of the workers sign a legally binding document that stated that they could not join any labor unions or else they wouldn't be rehired. This worked for many of the workers who believed that they would be treated better and would not need to have another strike in order to get decent treatment. They were among the millions of lower-class laborers in the United States that were dependent on their factory jobs. Thus, the workers could be easily replaced, and without the help of unions, they could be treated like a piece of garbage and still work for the company. The Pullman strike caused immediate reform and became the country's first national strike. The whole nation's railroad system was held still by the will of one state, and for the time, federal troops were called in to hold back strikers. The much-needed reform happened slowly, but with growing advocates became a huge priority for American economy. As other strikes across the nation continued to affect the working community and revenue gained from these industries, more and more people began paying attention to the workers and their message. The Pullman strike became a source of power and an example for other states and unions. showing the rest of the nation how much of a small group of individuals have over an authority figure, proving that a sum of people unified against an issue can make a huge difference, not only for themselves, but for the rest of the nation. Considering America's utopian views, this idea fueled many other strikes striving for the same cause. The Pullman strike set an example for the strikes that followed. It showed the people of Chicago that it was possible to form large unions willing to rebel against their employers. But the negativity that arose was that the employers learned to use the federal government to stop the strikes. Many large-scale strikes followed the Pullman strike, such as the Chicago Teamsters strike of 1905 and the strike of 1919. The Teamsters striked with a small clothing workers union in the summer of 1905, but it soon grew and eventually included nearly all the unions in the city. The strike was basically a struggle between Chicago and labor unions and the Employers Association of Chicago. It is considered the second most violent strike of the 20th century, exemplifying the severity of strike. The strike illustrates that unions had the potential to cause hectic damage. Due to the significant amount of strikes, by the 1930s, Congress finally recognized the labor unions and gave them the ability to strike without the injunctions of courts. The Pullman strike set off a chain reaction of labor strikes that would lead to the Congress's recognition of labor unions. This would change labor unions forever. Labor unions now had a voice and could legally rebel. In conclusion, the Pullman strike is ultimately the most influential strike in American history, changing the way unions were viewed and the rights and policies for most workforces. The strike showed the whole nation how powerful a union can be and became an example of how unification led to power and success. The Pullman strike opened up the idea that creating a union and refraining from work was the most efficient way to shutting down a company and getting the results they wanted quickly. Then, because of this realization, several strikes broke out across the nation, addressing the long overdue reform. The original goal of the strike was to change the labor force, but by shutting down the mail trains, they involved the whole nation. Because of the Pullman strike, the whole nation matured, and the growing unions supported the idea of equality and democracy, which began uniting the whole nation. As railroads were key to the nation's transportation and mail, strikers sought a perfect way to force companies to give them the better options and rights, bettering the American labor force as a whole. Without the Pullman strike and the incredible changes that followed, our lives would not be the same.